Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Stearns. I run the Arab Crossroads Studies program here at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I'm very happy to welcome you both to NYUAD and also to the second of a series of public lectures that we're having this year on the situation in Syria. And tonight, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Bassam Haddad to NYU Abu Dhabi. I'm happy about this for numerous reasons. First of all, we had an opportunity to hear a really wonderful lecture from him earlier today, also on Syria. But principally, I was attracted to the idea of bringing Bassam here after I saw him give some very invigorating and provocative, in a positive sense, that is, remarks at a past meeting of the Middle East Studies Association. And when we came to the issue of Syria, I really felt that we needed to have Bassam be part of that broader conversation here. So, actually telling you about Bassam, he's a very busy man, so I'll tell you that. He's director of the Middle East Studies Program and associate professor at the School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs at George Mason University. He has written Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, and has co-edited a volume on the dawn of the Arab uprisings. Aside from his academic production, he serves as founding editor of the Arab Studies Journal, which is a peer-reviewed research publication, and is also was the co-producer and director of an award-winning documentary film entitled About Baghdad. In addition to this, he's a director of a critically acclaimed film series on Arabs and terrorism, which was based on extensive interviews. And for many of us who study the Middle East and who have been following what's been happening, especially in the past 5 years, we've been dependent on an online journal called Jadaliyya, of which he is the co-founder and editor. And in addition to this, he's the executive director of the Arab Studies Institute, which is an umbrella organization for five other organizations. So, as I said, he's an extraordinarily busy person. In addition, I should want to draw special attention to a recent venture of his called Status, audio journal, which does something like what he did in Jadaliyya, but this way through interviews and kind of a podcast format online. So, all of that said, I feel very fortunate to have him here, to be able to bring him all the way across the ocean to us, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming him here to talk about Syria this evening.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the people and organizations who invited me, including Professor Stearns and Professor Lewis. I am very delighted to be here on multiple fronts. This place means a lot to me. Historically speaking, I actually lived in the UAE for more than 6 years in the 1970s when my parents moved here from Lebanon before we ended up actually moving to the United States. So coming back here for me and being able to come back with the capacity of a speaker is such a privilege, and it's such an honor to be here and to be accompanied by all of you. Unfortunately, however, I am not here as the bearer of good news. I'm speaking on Syria, after all, a very depressing topic. So I hope that my lecture doesn't actually make us too depressed tonight, and hopefully we will try to find some light. I have been working on Syria for many years, and I can say very comfortably that at this point, Syria represents the most complex case among the other Arab uprisings, largely because it lies at the intersection of various conflicts within the region and perhaps beyond. This makes it especially complex because all the other cases are complex and kind of makes it not just about Syria. So one of the problems in talking about Syria is that we are simultaneously talking about things beyond Syria, regional and international players and conflicts that actually are playing out in Syria. And of course, the ultimate victim here is the Syrian people, first and foremost. I have prepared my remarks so I don't overstay my welcome and so that we could have a discussion. So I will be reading my remarks. I will try to be as clear as possible, even though reading might actually kind of compel me to go a little faster, but we will have a bit more time as a result. The title of my talk is about Syria 5 years on, causes and dynamics, but it's actually part of my book that is underway now. And the title, the provisional title of the book kind of says it all. It's titled Understanding the Syrian Tragedy. After nearly 5 years since the start of the uprising, Syria continues to find itself divided and embattled, with no satisfactory or even unsatisfactory end in sight. More significantly, more than half of the Syrian population is displaced, and the death toll surpassed 300,000, some say 250, some say 350, by all counts. 4 million Syrians are now scattered as refugees in the region, in Europe and beyond, though not many actually, unfortunately, were taken by many Arab countries that neighbor Syria. The Syrian tragedy persists, and more than any other case of mass uprising in the region, continues to be shrouded in political power plays and contradictions at the local, regional, and international levels. Defined increasingly by an absence of a clear, favorable outcome, considering existing parties to the conflict, the logic of the lesser evil reigns supreme. In other words, all the significant players, without exception, involved in the Syrian conflict, internally and externally, are actually quite problematic, which is part of the Syrian tragedy, because there is not a horse that you can bet on without qualms. No matter how one spins the narrative about Syria, and no matter how horrible some of the players in the opposition have become, along with some of their patrons and supporters, the principal party that is responsible for the mayhem that we are witnessing is and remains the Syrian regime and its 4-decade legacy. So we could talk about an uprising that went off the tracks. We could talk about many repugnant things that some within the uprising or some within the Syrian situation have done. But it is really important to recognize the structural historical background to this conflict and how we got there. And this is why it's important to not start thinking about Syria beginning in March 2011. This is an outcome of several decades of a particular sort of rule that created a situation whereby what we are witnessing today has been made somewhat possible, despite the existence of interference and intervention that is itself problematic. There is no reasonable way to do justice to the title of this talk in 40 or 45 minutes or anything of the sort. Instead, I would like to share with you a few quick summaries or narratives. First, a quick background narrative and the big picture. What spurred the Syrian uprising? Why is it complex? And how its complexity is prolonging the conflict. A quick summary about the local players and the way they divide Syria's territory. This is something that we can move through rather quickly because different audiences actually have different information levels, and I'm happy to be here because there are many details that I could actually skip, recognizing that this audience is more aware of them than other audiences that are coming new to the topic. Maybe a quick summary about the regional and international players, and then I'll close with the implications of the Russian intervention and the current moment, which is something that I discussed this morning. In Syria, we have been witnessing an uprising since March 2011, spurred by the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings. The Syrian regime has been in power since 1970. It led a repressive rule that did not tolerate any inkling of dissent, and though it started out as somewhat egalitarian in its social and economic policies, it shifted gears towards crony capitalism after the late 1980s. That shift began to polarize Syrian society at a fast rate, exposing a sort of inequality in the social and economic senses that was unprecedented for decades. All the while, the repressive apparatus of Syria or of the Syrian regime remained in place. Thus, Syrians continued to be repressed politically while the semblance of equality that was brought about by state welfare was eroding. State welfare and largesse was no handout, as some, for instance, those who are familiar with the US context, as some conservatives in the US context complained, whereby The critique is that the government is giving handouts when it is actually engaged in redistribution. In Syria, redistribution of wealth is not considered a handout. It is an entitlement that is considered part and parcel of the social contract between states and societies in much of the post-colonial world as it is in many Arab countries. The state's redistributive commitments included in the provision of free education, free healthcare, public sector jobs, and food and energy subsidies. All these were gradually diminishing and in some cases disappearing starting in the 1990s, with the pace accelerating after 2005, 2006, and 2007, when the regime was increasingly dominated by business interests, both its own and that of the private sector, and was spurred by what is clumsily called the social market economy, which was announced in 2005, which for the first time put the word socialism in the background, officially speaking. Therefore, the main issue here refers to the social and economic polarization that animated the period between 2000 and 2010, with social and economic policy roots that date back to 1986. In short, the Syrian regime was originally based on a populist coalition that included labor as a major regime ally between 1963 to the early 1980s, with a serious shift in 1970 when Hafiz Assad took power. As economic hardships multiplied and the public economic sector approached bankruptcy, the regime began actively to shift alliances from labor to business. In other words, the regime initiated a transformation of its own rule from an authoritarianism of the left to an authoritarianism of the right. The crucible of this transformation is the gradual dismantling of the economic sector, or the state economic sector, I should say, or the unraveling of the centralized economy, where the distributive commitments of the state shrink gradually but do not disappear. And the role of private sector and select private business increases in the hope of compensating for the smaller public sector. The plan did not go as planned, and produced instead a new business class marked by rentierism, corruption, complicity, and the most detrimental quality, a risk-averse approach to investment which pushed investment only in non-productive ventures that did not provide added value. Hence, we saw a marked increase in manufacturing, a marked decrease in manufacturing and industry, and a complementary increase in commerce, services, and tourism, and not always of the good kind. This brought little added value to the economy, sent unemployment through the roof, and robbed a growing number of Syrian families from the largesse of the state without providing sufficient cushion by the private sector or the kind of trickle-down economics that was supposed to jumpstart an ailing economy. The result was a quick consumerist and speculative surge in the early 1990s, kind of like the internet bubble in the US in the 1990s or the real estate bubble in the 2000s, when the government officially recognized the role of the public sector, that is in the 1990s when the consumerist boom took place. This speculative boom soon sent the Syrian economy south for years to come, as it was based on the illusion of growth. The result was an increasingly disenfranchised Syrian public, notwithstanding the shrinking middle class that enjoyed the boom and the regime's wide networks of cronies, beneficiaries, and state officials. This state of affairs continued through the 2000s and through Assad Sr.'s death, and was accelerated in 2005 with the announcement of the social market economy by the new consolidated regime of Bashar Assad. The years between 2000 and 2003, 2004 were kind of relatively stagnant because of the need to consolidate the regime after Hafiz Assad departed, for which he actually planned a relatively smooth institutional and personnel transition, which in fact succeeded, as opposed to what many analysts thought would happen in Syria after Assad's death. The years between 2005 and 2010, therefore, were key, in which they were marked by an acceleration of neoliberal-like economic policies that exacerbated social polarization, which already was underway since the late 80s and early 1990s. Chief among these ways in which polarization was exacerbated is the gradual withdrawal of subsidies that constitute the last line of defense for economically defenseless and dependent populations. That created a rift that is even larger than ever. Two more variables exacerbated social polarization in Syria, and we're talking about the growing gap between, crudely speaking, the haves and the have-nots. We can go in more detail, deconstruct and parse, but this is the big picture. Two more variables contributed to this polarization. First, another form of polarization was at play since the 1980s, and that is regional polarization, which is basically the urban-rural split, not regional as in the region or the Iqlim. The urban-rural polarization and the distance between development in the urban and rural areas was exacerbated through the relative neglect of the countryside in the prevalent economic and social policies from the 1980s, and that is not something that happened only in Syria. Second was a natural disaster. The drought in the early 2000s, which continued through most of the decade, led to further deterioration of agriculture and the countryside, and the gradual displacement of more than 1 million people, some say a lot more, into smaller and larger cities, putting additional strains on them, which actually created a serious problem for small towns and, of course, in rural areas naturally, because they could not handle the small towns, the influx, whereas the larger towns, the metropolitan towns like Damascus and Halab and Aleppo could handle the influx as a function of their higher living standard, and at the time, in the mid-2000s, as a function of the inflow of capital from Iraq. مصائب قوم. Without going into much detail and keeping with the time allotted, the outcome of these and other processes was not a mass uprising, but mass discontent. And here I would like to affirm that what I'm sharing with you is not the reason, the cause of the uprising. It is a very important factor without which we cannot understand the uprising as a mass operation, as a mass variable. And there are other reasons that are beyond the political economic trajectory, but this is the reason that we hear about the least, and we hear about many other things the most. I'm referring to what contributed in disproportional ways to the increase in mass discontent. How we move from mass discontent to revolution is not a straight line, it's not a clear line, and it's not even a process that we can process trace as some believe they can do for every event in the social sciences, which is one of the reasons why even political scientists who believe they can explain anything actually admit that they cannot predict revolution, precisely because of the difficulty of explaining how we go from point A to point B. I'm trying to explain the rise in mass discontent. We would need a lot more time to actually try to move from this state of affairs to the actual uprising, although we have some clues. Still, the growing social and economic polarization was not sufficient to send people to the streets in a state that does not even tolerate a critical sentence in an article if it tainted the upper echelons of the regime or the regime's cornerstones. But the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia, with their relative success, spurred people in provincial towns in Syria to rise up, slowly and gradually. People in the countryside and small towns were the first to rise up because they were the most repressed and the most deprived since by 2011. And this is what can be called basically the double effect or the dual polarization. The polarization between rich and poor, if you will, in Syria in the past 25 years before 2011, and the polarization in development between rural areas and urban areas combined to produce the worst effect for people living in the rural areas because they were harmed by both types of polarization. And it's no wonder that this started in Syria, in the countryside, because of this fact. In fact, not only did Syria experience this, but so did Tunisia and Egypt. The Tunisian uprising did not start in the city. It started in Sidi Bouzid. And the Egyptian uprising did not start in Tahrir Square. It started elsewhere, whether it's Ismailia or Port Said, and then came to the city. There is something about the pattern of regional development within these countries that explains why discontent was larger and more serious in the areas outside the metropole. Initially, Rami Makhlouf, the president's economic mogul cousin, served as the convergence point of these protests. These protests in Syria were not anti-regime. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام is not something that started out at the beginning of the Syrian uprising. It's something that became such. But the brutal repression of the initial protests widened the scope of demand and the areas of protest, even if they were limited to the countryside and the smaller cities. And of course, what helped these protests as well in a negative direction was the kind of external interference and meddling that happened rather quickly. Some say from the very beginning, some say after the first few months, and some say within the first year. But it definitely happened early on. The rest is history, but it's actually not. As in, things got really messy. It wasn't that we had an uprising against a repressive regime and then the rest is basically a narrative of a struggle for democracy against the dictatorship. It got much more complicated, which is why we're still here almost 5 years on, unfortunately. What started as a civilian uprising against dictatorship quickly turned into an opportunity for a host of local, regional, and international players to try their hand at intervening and maximizing their own interests in what became a regional and somewhat international struggle to redraw the political map of the region based on the outcomes of the Syrian uprising. So it became something else very quickly. The opposition was infiltrated by anti-regime forces who suddenly started speaking about democracy, like some Arab countries. It was handily supported by Turkey, a country that has its own problems with its own Kurdish minority, and by their allies outside the region, principally the United States, who viewed Syria as a linchpin of the Iran-Hezbollah Syria anti-Israel and anti-imperialist axis. The same applies to the other countries, including Russia and Iran, because every time we talk about the meddling in the Syrian uprising that the US, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, for instance, engaged in, some respond, but Iran and Russia are also engaged in this, especially when you talk about US meddling. People are quick to say, but look at Iran and Russia. The issue here is true. Iran and Russia also meddled, except that these countries never really championed democracy or human rights compared to, for instance, the United States, which does until today present this narrative. So at least we win as the United States, I'm speaking here, the double standard game. All this is to say that the democratic struggle and relatively carte blanche or blind support for anyone fighting the Syrian regime transformed the Syrian uprising into a militant one and transformed its nationalist core into an ostensibly Islamist one, at least in terms of the spearhead of the militant opposition, and an Islamist one in a certain sense, not just any Islamist sense. The civilian opposition remains today the most numerous, but also the most marginalized and disillusioned by the turn of events, especially when many Syrians and observers began to recognize that the strongest forces opposed to the regime are neither representative of the original sentiments of the uprisings, nor necessarily a better or good alternative to the regime. Thus, we began to see opposition forces fighting both each other and the regime at the same time, and we saw regional and international intervention flip-flopping and crossing lines with the local maze of conflicts. In the beginning, Assad must go for Hillary and Obama. Later on, Assad maybe not must go because of what has happened in terms of the development of ISIS and other concerns. The result is a hyphenated word that I cannot actually say in public in an academic setting, but it pretty much explains this situation. Two immediate questions come to mind. Why did the Syrian uprising in particular produce or attract such noise or contestation? And the answer is simple. Though Syria does not have any oil or similar natural resources to speak of to become a target of contestation, it has always been a geostrategic asset since the 1940s and 50s. And the Baghdad Pact context. It has been a pivotal state that lies at the intersection of various overlapping struggles in the region. The Palestine-Israel conflict, the Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict, and you can add lots of things here. The mostly manufactured Shi'i-Sunni conflict. I say manufactured because at some point you could see that it has been internalized, but it is not something that is endemic and must happen. There are instances where we don't see this happening historically and today in time and space. The resistance versus imperialism conflict, and recently the jihadist or takfiri, I don't like the word jihadist, I think takfiri is more apt, versus the rest conflict. The rest even includes the rest of the Islamists as well. To be sure, there's more. There's a lot more in which the Syrian uprising is lodged, and each deserves a long set of caveats. But I'll stop here and turn to the players involved and the territories that are today controlled by three basic categories. I realize that this audience is not in need of a very basic expose of players and maybe even territories, but I'll just remark a little bit about the three main areas that you see up here on the map. The gray area being an ISIS-controlled area. Mostly it's basically deserted, but it is not insignificant. The red areas refer to the regime's control or its supporters, militias, what have you. The green area is what is commonly called the opposition. You see them in the north, around central Syria, and in the south and around Damascus. And of course, the fourth category is the Kurds, which are somewhat separate, largely because they have been trying to, for various reasons, to be outside this conflict, this anti-regime conflict. Not that they are supportive of the regime, but they have their own conflicts and tensions to deal with in the north, notably with ISIS and other groups. But the three main areas that we're talking about are listed here. The most complex one is the green one, because the red areas are regime areas, and it's pretty much straightforward. The gray areas, it's ISIS, and it's also pretty much straightforward. The green areas include various groups, such as the Al-Jabhat al-Nusra, to begin with, the Free Syrian Army, which Jabhat al-Nusra requires very little explanation. It's basically a faction of Al-Qaeda. The Free Syrian Army, which is very vague and complex, and nobody knows what the Free Syrian Army is, but we all know what the Free Syrian Army is. So it's kind of a weird thing. However, the one thing to note is that the Free Syrian Army can be identified by its explicitly non-Islamist agenda. So we're not saying, of course, anti-Islamist or anything of the sort, but it doesn't have an explicitly Islamist agenda. These are the rebels that actually enter into the fight, sometimes simply to fight the regime without really necessarily joining a particular group, which actually the other groups constitute the spearhead of the anti-regime opposition. Sometimes it's a function of personal decision as a result of a bombing. It could be various reasons. And then, of course, you have the many smaller groups, not necessarily smaller than the Free Syrian Army, actually bigger, but smaller than ISIS, let's say. And they rival in size, in some cases, the Jabhat al-Nusra. And these include Harar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, Suqur al-Sham, which have at various points, and many others, formed and unformed coalitions. So they come together and break apart and come together and break apart, but the elements involve Ahrar Sham, Jaish al-Islam, and a few other groups that are important to note once we get into the details if we're going in that direction. And then, of course, you see that, on the ground, empirically, the groups that tried to emulate or to produce a state-like existence are mainly ISIS, which was semi-successful in producing its own governance, its own administration, its own judiciary, its own economic system, adjudication, and so on. The other group that also approximated a state, but also fell short, is the Kurds. The others have not been able to actually do the same. And we see this in various parts, and we see it in Idlib that has been recently captured by opposition forces that are not ISIS. And I'm not sure if ISIS can be fairly placed within the opposition or outside the opposition, but it is a subject of discussion. But the other opposition forces that took Idlib, until today, they haven't been able to produce a very stable form of governance and the other trappings of a state. We can also say that what is missing from this picture and what is missing from 9 out of 10 articles, discussions, or even more than 9 out of 10 on Syria, and I judge this not because of my casual reading, but because of the systemic review of almost every single article written in English and in Arabic on Syria, which actually ends up being reviewed by our weekly Jadaliya Syria Roundup in Arabic and in English. We survey every week several hundred pieces, and then we list in our weekly Roundup a fraction of them that we think are important. Not because they are correct, but because sometimes it's important to see what the view, for instance, of the US government is, even if it is not on point. So we actually list those. And it's significant that very few talk about the largest proportion of Syrians who are not involved with the regime, not involved with ISIS, not involved with Jabhat al-Nusra, Free Syrian Army, Ahrar Sham, and even the Kurds. And it's basically the civilian population, which is kind of part of the local coordinating committee that actually spurred the uprising early on. But then once the uprising became weaponized or militarized, they became marginal. They were marginalized by the sound of the barrel bombs and the sound of the bullets and the artillery and so on. And this is the one thing that I'm happy to share that is actually positive. These constitute the potential promise of what Syria could be despite this mayhem, despite this catastrophe. And we do notice that a lot of these people have actually become somewhat resigned, not because they don't have commitment, but they've become resigned because the narrative, the discourse is so polarizing and so binary-like that it's not useful. Being for the regime or anti-regime is not useful. Being for an opposition that has actually been either hijacked or spearheaded by forces that do not represent the original sentiments of the uprising is not useful. A lot of these people are basically not sitting and doing nothing. They are making Syria happen. They are making Syria continue. They are actually the ones that are running and working in places like schools, civil society organizations, churches, mosques, what have you. They are keeping Syria going. And it is important to not, those of us who don't go into Syria, and I don't go into Syria, but I am in touch with several people in Syria who are from different backgrounds and have different sort of orientations and leanings. Although most of these people now are in one large circle that is opposed to the kind of extremism we see and opposed to a return to the regime, the ancien regime, or to the pre-uprising period, though they differ internally as to where they stand. And they tell you that it is significant that there is a movement, there is civil society in Syria. There are people who are working hard to keep Syria going. And it's these people that the future of Syria will, on these people's shoulders, the future of Syria will rest no matter what happens. The militants will either go home or melt into the population. This is not the first time we see a civil war, which is itself a very odd phrase. We don't think about it, a civil war. Anyway, that situation of territories and people and opposition groups versus the regime is now actually has been transformed into something else. And it has been transformed by a number of factors that we have seen changing from the very beginning until now, with the militarization of the opposition and then the radicalization of the opposition, irrespective of who actually participated in this process. And we can talk about this because other players, outside players, have participated in this process thinking the regime's downfall is imminent, so it doesn't matter who you support in the short run because there will be no long run. And they, of course, miscalculated because there was a long run and the regime was still there, and they created a Frankenstein. The regime also is very aware of these tactics and of the tactics that are needed to support its own interests, and they actually help the process to weaponize and radicalize the opposition, because that ended up serving the regime's interests, as we have seen. And then when you created a Frankenstein, or when a Frankenstein appeared to be on the other side and to be the most powerful, you saw how the perspective and stance of everyone relatively changed. From Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who hit the brakes on supporting groups because you want to make sure you're supporting the right groups, and it's difficult to know that, to the United States, who actually was adamant about Bashar leaving and now is hitting the brakes. The only country that has been a bit reluctant but joined the fold was Turkey. Still, it joined the fold in the end. And of course, that opened the door for Russia not only to intervene on the side of an ailing regime to support it and prevent its collapse, but to also appear as a savior, to also appear as a regional and an international player, and to also bring back its place in the world as it was earlier. And that was an opportunity that it actually took and produced what we have today, which is a very interesting stalemate. And I say interesting because it's not really a stalemate as much as a temporary semi-victory for the regime, because it was truly on the border, on the verge of not necessarily collapse, but it was on the verge of beginning to lose even the military battle as a result of lack of resources, lack of fighters, lack of morale, lack of funds, and so on and so forth. Even with the support of various militias, Hezbollah and Iran, that intervention was actually quite crucial in creating a different reality. And I will talk about this next. I have a number of things that I'm skipping, and I would like to have an opportunity to talk about them. I'll just mention them, because in the Q&A we can talk about them. The dynamics of the uprising, basically the idea of why the regime has maintained its cohesiveness, as opposed to other cases in the uprisings like Tunisia and Egypt, where the military was able to interfere in a relatively autonomous fashion to basically oust the head of state. In Syria, that was not possible because of the cohesiveness of the institutional makeup of the Syrian regime, which was by design, started in 1970, and we can talk about this. The heterogeneity of society in Syria, whether natural or not manufactured, but helped and supported also by the regime, which turned heterogeneity into divisiveness, with a good number of the population to its side, simply because of the fact that it's protecting it, not because of this population in Syria having internalized the regime's values. So lots of the minorities, including the Kurds and the other minorities, don't necessarily support or internalize the Syrian regime's values, but they know that this is a better deal than the alternative. So that creates a rational situation, which, if you're sitting on the outside, might feel that, oh, the minorities love Assad or support Assad, or the regime. It's much more complex, and those sitting in this audience, I think, understand that dynamic. And this heterogeneity, however, made it very difficult for collective action to take place. We don't have the same heterogeneity in, for instance, again, Tunisia and Egypt. And that kind of also played a role in the dynamics of the Syrian conflict, primarily in prolonging it and preventing or raising the bar for the requirements for collective action. The narratives of the dynamics is also another topic that we can talk about. There are three basic narratives, and I will not specify too much, but one is, I call the naive narrative, the narrative of the people who would like to believe that the Syrian uprising is really simply about a democratic movement struggling against a dictatorship. The dictatorship part is stable, is true. But the rest of this narrative actually requires some revision. I call this the naive narrative. The second is the conspiratorial, which is the narrative that everybody wanted to just get rid of the regime from the very beginning. Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United States and Turkey, it was a conspiracy from the very beginning, planned from the very beginning, even from the outside. And that's untenable because it's an insult to the Syrian people to tell them that you have nothing to complain about in the past 40 years. So what you're doing is just a function of external meddling. That's also not tenable and not rational and unacceptable analytically. We are left with the third narrative, which is the messy narrative, which I'm trying to share with you. And of course, everyone speaking on Syria has their own approach, but I assure you that anybody that caters to the first two narratives is taking you on a ride. I think the situation is messy, and we need to have the patience, the largesse, and the courage, which is very important, to talk about things as they are, even when it affects the people, groups, countries, even principles that we believe in the sense that they can be implicated in the problem. And it takes courage to speak about this. And in this university setting, or any university setting, this is a good place actually to do it, because sometimes outside it's very difficult to be honest. And this applies to every single country worldwide. In terms of the opposition dynamics, I'll just say a few words because this is a can of worms before I get to the current situation. The fatal mistake of the opposition, and that can be talked about in isolation from external support, but it becomes more exacerbated when you consider external support. The fatal mistake of the opposition is that it prioritized the fighting the regime at any cost over building an independent and broad-based opposition. And what that did is that it got it neither. Neither was it able to overturn the regime nor build a broad-based independent, I'm not going to even say democratic, but a broad-based independent opposition. It was not broad-based, even though at some level early on it was much broader, and it was not independent because it was dependent on its patrons. And its patrons, whether it's the Arab countries, Turkey, or the United States, are serving their own interests, not the Syrian people's interests. Because all these countries, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the United States, less so the United States, supported Assad over the years and the previous decades. So it's not a puzzle that this is messy. It's not a puzzle that supporting the opposition was a function of interests, which did not necessarily comport with the original values of the uprising. The fatal mistake of the supporters of the opposition, which I just named, of course there's more. There's the Europeans, and today I said something that basically offended somebody or maybe some people because I didn't give the Europeans a lot of weight, but also the Europeans are included here, so I will include the Europeans in the bad mistakes as well. The fatal mistake of their supporters, of the supporters of the uprising, is that they underestimated the resilience of the regime and built their entire strategy on the assumption that its downfall is going to be rather fast, similar to what happened elsewhere. And that was a fatal mistake because in reality, of course, that did not happen. And it created a counterproductive situation for all these players. And now we are where we are. Now, the Russian intervention. Of course, I'll start by saying that the talks in Geneva, as you have heard today and yesterday, failed. They didn't go anywhere, which was a huge shock for me personally. I'm joking. But they were not going to go anywhere to begin with. They didn't even meet. Did you know that they actually didn't meet? So these talks were not necessarily talks between the different parties that are in conflict, which is very odd. Kind of like when you're fighting with your girlfriend and you're talking to her friends and she's talking to your friends and you're not talking to her and she's not talking to you. It's not going to go anywhere. The Syrian catastrophe, of course, rages on with vigor today, even if in more predictable ways compared to 2014. The last chapter that we saw is the chapter of the Russian intervention, which has escalated the war and added significantly to the daily casualties of civilians and fighters, as well as to the systemic destruction brought most of all by the bombing, both by Russia and the regime that has actually naturally increased after the intervention. The Russian intervention, most of all, whatever its particular objectives, has all but eliminated the bewilderment as to what might happen next in Syria. Many wondered how long the regime will last given its dwindling human and other resources, let alone its moral and its morale and fatigue. Despite support from Iran, Hezbollah, and a slew of militias, mainly from Iraq, the advances of mid-2015 by its opposition all but confirmed that the regime has passed its fighting peak at the same time that the source of supply of fighters on the other side seemed bottomless. Just in May, the regime was in a very precarious situation at a time when economic resources were dwindling, its economic health was actually going down and deteriorating, and the reservoir of fighters ended. The only reservoir was time, because every year people come of age and join the army or are forced to join the army or join the refugees. So it was a bleak picture. But all that changed in fall 2015 when Russia threw its weight directly into the battlefield, not only against ISIS, which is the purported rationale, but against the infrastructure of the opposition to the regime, which includes nearly everyone else save the Kurds, because the Russian intervention ultimately is targeting the entire infrastructure of the opposition as well as ISIS, not just ISIS. And that was not necessarily a shock. From the very beginning, it was evident why Russia, at least in part, was in Syria. Considering the additional fighting power on the regime's side since this fall, and the continued disarray, incoherence, and external meddling by various players into the on the side of the opposition, the Russian intervention guaranteed so far that we have to look for solutions that don't involve the sudden implosion of the regime. This is simply a reality, not a desire. This is, if you look at the situation on the battlefield today, and if you look at the political situation today, on the battlefield, especially the past week as an indicator, the regime is gaining grounds, the opposition is losing grounds. The US is content to pretend like it is upset with what's going on, but at some level it is actually relatively content, irrespective of some internal tension in the United States. European countries are very keen on stopping the flow of the refugees, and Russia could be the horse that does that, or it could not be, but it is a possibility. The Arab countries that supported members of the opposition or groups within the opposition are very apprehensive and cautious, which means the flow is reduced. So you have the elements of a stalemate that is likely to endure, and a stalemate in which there is a serious asymmetry where the regime is likely to be not on the winning side, there are no winners, but likely to be on the side that is not going to go away anytime soon. Considering the additional fighting power and these matters, the regime is in a very interesting situation. It is likely that the regime will yet grow more obstinate about a transition which was in the cards earlier, even a transition that preserves its existence as a social entity. The idea from the regime's perspective, if you follow the regime's discourse, and we do very closely as we do the other discourses, if you follow the regime's discourse, the idea from the regime's perspective is the following. If we were not willing to budge when we suffered reversals in our advances earlier in 2015, as in May, for instance, we will certainly not do it now. Thus, the end of the guessing game regarding a possible regime collapse, no matter how unfounded to begin with. So within the Syrian context, you see a very simple strategic game. And that is not something that is new to the regime. It's been its position since Assad came to power. On the one hand, the regime is not likely to compromise if it is in a weak position. If you trace historically the moments of conflict, you'll see that the regime doesn't compromise when it's in a weak position. It usually seeks, like every rational actor, to strengthen its position. When it is in a strong position, the regime will never compromise, right? So it's like a closed circle. And it is a function of a particular mindset, rationality that characterizes the regime. And hopefully this will change, because otherwise there will be no transition and no transfer, save some serious military intervention that is even more powerful than the Russian one. Now, the challenge is to pave the way for an exit from this conflict while avoiding two realities. I'll speak about these two realities and then I'll stop. The first reality to avoid is the regression into the status quo ante, a return to regime rule. This is something to avoid because it is now the possibility, at least in some territories, to avoid going back to regime rule, even though it's not possible in the sense that it was, but it is possible in a new sense. As much as some would like to believe that though they don't care for Assad or the regime, this might be the best choice among better alternatives, there are concrete developments and factors on the ground that will prevent this scenario from being anything more than temporary. Going back to regime rule cannot be more than temporary or limited. Morally speaking, it would also be repulsive after the death and destruction the regime unleashed in the past 5 years and the systemic repression against nearly all Syrians during the previous 4 decades for the regime to go back to where it was. The regime's principal allies, Iran and Russia, are continuously misunderstood in terms of their intentions, and that is not a defense or support, it's basically an observation. True, they are supporting Assad directly and partaking in the problems that are facing Syria and that probably caused what's happening in Syria at some level. But they are both, in their own way, willing to see a Syria that falls short from the loyalty of Assad, but that doesn't necessarily slip out of their control. In other words, they are less loyal to the particular form of the Syrian leadership than the larger picture of the regime where they can actually continue to have influence. We saw that in the beginning of the uprising when Iran was kind of miffed that the Syrian regime was using excessive force and so on, and we still have that possibility. A lot of people assume that Putin and Assad have some sort of organic connection. They don't. The connection is rational, interest-based, and it has to do with a Syria that can constitute a zone of power and influence for Russia, to an extent similarly with Iran. After all, any serious analysis of the impact of the Iranian and Russian policies in the region, no matter how cruel or cynical, would yield that these interests have been in both reality and ambition relatively modest, if only for rational reasons having to do with their own comparative capacities in relation to the forces and support stacked on the other side, especially since 1991. Iran and Russia's ambitions in the region and their capacity to influence their region are dwarfed by the other side. So it is important to keep that in perspective. So this reality that is to be avoided, which is a return to Assad or Ba'athist or the ancien regime rule, is less out of reach than many assume under the right circumstances. However, unfortunately, the second reality to avoid makes the procurement of those circumstances much harder to attain. In other words, something helps this return of the regime to rule, and that is what's happening on the other side. The second reality to avoid is less destructive in the aggregate, less systematically repressive as of yet perhaps equally problematic on various political and moral levels. That is the reality of the triumph, the potential triumph of the most powerful anti-regime fighting forces on the ground in Syria with their supporters, Arab, Turkish, US supporters over the past years. The reactionary and poorly calculated support of Arab countries to any opposition to the regime will not bring Syria any peace or dignity, nor will the mini-imperialistic and ill-thought support of the Turkish government. Finally, the callous attitude of US foreign policy towards human life in the region generally, which reached barbaric proportions in Iraq since the 1990s sanctions and the following criminal invasion/war in 2003, will not provide Syrians with the dignity that the US has denied Iraqis, Palestinians, Saudis, and others who live under repressive regimes. To expect the United States to seek true dignity for most Syrians is like expecting the Taliban to take up feminism in order to oust Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. In sum, though this second reality to be avoided is itself a farce, because the rule of these disparate forces within the opposition fighting the regime and each other is difficult to attain, it is important to observe that the extent to which it will be used as a tool to preserve a variety of interests to the coterie of countries lined up behind. In other words, it's very important to see the extent to which these players will constitute a tool by various other actors against the regime. But this tool is not capable of governing. As somebody asked me today, and I loved the questions I got today because they were very engaging and they skipped the kind of questions, and I'll be very honest, the kind of questions I get in the United States that force me to speak for about 30 minutes just to convince audiences that Arabs are actually people. They have similar interests and aspirations, and they eat ice cream and they love and dance. So a question today was, what is that bounds or binds the opposition groups together? And it was very difficult to answer that because there isn't one thing that does beyond fighting the regime, and even that has become empirically less of a priority. A lot of them are actually fighting each other at some points, or actually weary about the other almost as much as they are about the regime in some areas. Thus, these forces might continue to be used to avoid a full return of the regime, however unrealistic that is, but the unintended consequences of supporting these forces and possibly these forces so far and possibly into the future will continue to pose the biggest obstacles to a post-conflict Syria that excludes the worst expressions of regime and opposition. From the very beginning, again, the uncalculated and ideologically driven support for anything fighting the regime has been the single most counterproductive strategy that gradually placed the nails on the coffin of the Syrian uprising, at least on its original sentiments and expression. Now, a word on what's happening on the ground, and I'll stop. There is much analysis about the receding infrastructural, human, and financial power of the regime. We can discuss this more shortly if you like. This is true in terms of the regime's own fighting force and capacity, the slow demoralization of government institutions, the dwindling economic health, and shortage of fighting forces. But the picture is actually worse among the most opponents of the regime, and the regime helps to make sure that this continues to be the case. Not only are the regime's opponents divided, but their ability to govern, as I shared earlier, and maintain prolonged safety of the populations in their territory is quite poor. A good example is the poor functioning of the semblance of government in the recently conquered province of Idlib, controlled by Jaysh al-Fath, as I shared. True, ISIS in the Kurdish areas are somewhat of an exception, but they too have their own set of problems, and in all cases do not mesh with the aspirations of most Syrians for various reasons. ISIS is not going to be the savior of Syria no matter what happens, and the Kurds basically have their own situation where they don't want to be the saviors of Syria. They just want to be left alone, to have some autonomy. And for the most part, they're not interested in territorial gains outside a certain limited set of territories. So we remain in a locked stalemate where even newly conquered territories are likely to be poorly managed and governed by both sides, because now the regime is so bereft of resources that even when it conquers territories, it's not able to govern in the same manner it was able to do in the past. Exhaustion is reigning supreme, and brute power is the only effective governor. But brute power does not have a long shelf life. We are thus likely to witness either a decisive year, this year, not in terms of solutions per se, but in terms of long-standing status quo, perhaps over and above the debate over whether Assad or the Syrian regime will be part of a transitional or a permanent government or not part of either. The tragedy goes on, and you can always bet that most observers will be watching to see how all this will play out at the regional and international levels, not how many Syrians' lives will be destroyed, and certainly not how Syria itself is vanishing.
I am Syrian. I'm from Latakia, the city of the president, but not from the same. The area which I live is different sect from his sect. I think you missed something, which is the Israeli factor. I know it is hidden, but it is there. We know it very well. And you know the last meeting with Netanyahu and Putin, and then the coordination between the Russian, let me say, military, and also the Israeli, and especially when the Israeli came and hit some areas in Syria in order not to go, weapons to go to Hezbollah. And I mean, you said at the end that about the fighting troops there, the Islamic fighting troops, that they have no agenda, let me say one agenda, everyone has different agenda from the other.
The opposition.
The opposition, yes. For example, in Idlib, there is no ISIS, by the way. ISIS is far away from Idlib. And you know, the Russian, for example, hit Idlib just claiming that there is ISIS. But there is no ISIS, no terrorists there. All of them free opposition. And I think this is like a justification for supporting the regime. In a way, we can say that Russia is occupying Syria because the regime is illegal, and they came because the illegal regime asking them to come. So both of them illegal, and it is occupation in a way. Thank you.
Please.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for your talk. It was very enlightening. The question I am struggling with, and maybe you have an answer to it, but I haven't heard in any of the news media, is what is Russians' appetite for how long they're going to be engaged in Syria? And obviously they have in the rear view their thing with Afghanistan. And if they were to leave in a short period of time, 6 months to a year, would that immediately entail a downfall of the Assad regime? Thank you.
One final question for this round here.
Thank you again for the overview. My main question maybe come up from the stalemate situation that's happening right now, that might go for a long time. Is dividing Syria on the way, or is it solution? Do you see this as an end for a stalemate, as we see from a map, especially that also emphasize that the regime is not able to control more areas infrastructure-wise?
Can we get a question from a female? They're usually smarter than us.
Do you want to answer those three first?
Oh, sure. Oh, we have one. Okay, I've got them down.
When you were talking about the opposition's mistake underestimating the regime, you were talking about the demonstrations, right? So I've got the impression that you had an alternative like ways or to get rid of the regime. So could you please tell us more about that?
I overbid myself. I shouldn't have suggested that because that's a very tough question. How to get rid of the regime? Okay, I'll answer as quickly as I can, leaving some room perhaps for other questions. I agree with a lot of what you said. I didn't miss the Israel factor as much as it is actually a factor operating in the background in the plans and interests of the United States. I mean, the entire idea that the Israel-Hezbollah-Iran axis needs to actually be cut down to size, irrespective of the problematics of the Syrian regime or Iran, or what anyone can say about any of these of this axis, that is part and parcel for why Syria actually would be better, for instance, if it's divided, or if it's weakened, or if it is run by a coalition, not a central government that has a particular stance that is representative of the people, actually, vis-a-vis Israel and its settler, colonial, and apartheid existence. So there is a lot of this going on, and unfortunately, a lot of Arab countries have actually begun to warm up to the existence of Israel in its current state. So Israel is in the background, kind of like in the second war in Iraq, where it was sort of in the it was in the background, but it wasn't acting. The US was acting on its behalf. And the pushing of the fraudulent war in Iraq, which even the CIA now says there was no reason for it, and the reasons given were all faulty. Even the people pushing for it in the United States were also thinking about Israel's interests and had Israel's interests in mind. The actual 2005 formidable push to strike Syria was also a function of support for what was viewed then as something that will benefit Israel. So it's always in the background, but it's not playing as much of a role actively itself here. In fact, when the United States early on, along with some of the Arab countries and Turkey, were calling for the removal of Assad, Israel was the only country, despite its differences inside, that was basically saying, whoa, 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 whoa. When Rahin, who do you think is likely to actually replace this regime? On the one hand, the regime supports Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has given us the most headache we've seen maybe since Abdel Nasser, but the regime actually suits our interests. Our borders with the regime is the safest in the world for 30 years, and we don't know who's going to come next. The Israeli formula has always been, we want a regime that is weak enough so that we can beat it, but strong enough so it can prevent parts of its population to actually create a Hezbollah-like militia or party or movement. So Israel had this position not for the love of Syrians, but to preserve its own interests. In terms of Russia hitting the opposition, as I shared earlier, the Russian mission in Syria is not against ISIS. I mean, as in against ISIS, period. The Russian mission in Syria, in my view, is motivated primarily by bigger issues than Syria altogether. But when it comes to Syria, it's to prevent the regime collapse, to create the foundations for a potential transition or stalemate that could stay for a very long time. And I'll address your question about about their appetite, although I don't have inside information. And is also to help destroy the infrastructure of the opposition. You cannot just fight ISIS. Even if you just want to fight ISIS, you also have to make sure that the areas around it, from a military perspective, are actually not run by weaker parties that could actually provide ISIS with an exit. So the regime, the Russians are also hitting areas that are likely to be picked up by the regime in order to tighten the noose on ISIS. And a byproduct is to get rid of the infrastructure of the opposition. So, of course, the Russians are not just hitting ISIS. Everyone knows that. And it's almost like something that they will tolerate up to a certain point. Every once in a while, the State Department releases a condemnation, and then you see things settling for a couple of days. So it's an equilibrium that is quite tricky. And ISIS is no longer in Idlib. In the beginning, they were able to make moves and capture parts, but they couldn't because ISIS is an entity that is most comfortable with a particular kind of social, tribal, construction where it can actually rule. If you look at where ISIS, I will use my laser because I asked somebody for a laser, so I'm using it. So if you look at the area between here and here in Iraq, you find that ISIS is actually most successful in areas where the social construction is very tribal-like, with the exception of Mosul, which I said earlier today that was captured primarily because of the exit of the other side from the Shi'i-led government. And I say that because the government has been quite sectarian, making people in Mosul almost, happy because ISIS came. And in a way, the ISIS expansion is limited to areas with low demands and with a similar kind of social structure. So yes, ISIS was kicked out of Idlib, and it's actually limited in where it is. And ISIS has been exaggerated. I have a whole discussion of ISIS, which I didn't share here. But ISIS has been exaggerated in terms of its ability to rule the region, or even Iraq and Syria. It's always been exaggerated. But on the other side, there are a lot of people who considered ISIS just an ephemeral thing, and that is a big mistake, because ISIS doesn't exist simply to carry out its objectives. ISIS exists because there is a mood in the entire region that a lot of what ISIS represents, without the extremism and the beheadings, is something that actually needs to be addressed in terms of the marginalization, quote unquote, of quote unquote Sunnism from an Asabiyya perspective, whether it's the repression of the Islamists in a fascist way by Sisi or semi-fascist way, whether it is what happened in Syria from their point of view, whether it is the Sunni populations ruled by governments even in the Arab Gulf and beyond that are not necessarily representative of the larger, what is called from an Asabiyya perspective, like a Sunni independence and power, and so on. So ISIS represents a sentiment that will not go away even if you destroy the heads of ISIS. It is going to reproduce itself in something perhaps even worse or something similar. So we cannot dismiss ISIS, and we don't have to worry about ISIS taking over the world. It's again, somewhere in between. It's that messy center that nobody wants to deal with because it takes courage to deal with the mess. Second, Russia's appetite for how long they are ready to stay. This is a good question. I don't know, but I can tell you this. Russia is staying in Syria at very little expense. In fact, it is making strides every day and gaining power and authority in the region and beyond in ways that are reprehensible, at least to the people who are being bombed to death, that are not necessarily fighters, but it is actually in military terms and in political terms and geostrategic terms not going to go away anytime soon. I would say short to medium run, because there is no cost to it being there. In fact, there are some perceived gains. All the other sides, the Arabs, Europeans, Americans, Turks, are not willing to basically, if there's a vacuum or an exit of Russia, it's not like they are either willing to replace what it's doing or willing to take the initiative again after what has happened. Is divided Syria a solution? No, I'm adamant about the opinion, or my opinion, that Syria will not be divided. This talk about Syria will be divided and that Sykes-Picot will fall apart. It's funny, we're like defending Sykes-Picot. I'm not defending Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot is horrible. But that the Syrian map as we know it is going to be altered significantly, it's not going to happen. It will be altered. Now, it is altered in an empirical sense. A lot of people actually say that the three basic areas that are shared here are likely to become the new reality that will produce unknown outcomes, but it will actually be based on, for now, the regime, ISIS, which will continue for some time, but not forever, and then the opposition. And some people even say that the opposition might actually one day begin to cozy up to the regime, not in the sense that it becomes pro-regime, but parts of the opposition might play a role that is similar to what the PA is playing in Israel, for instance, which is very odd, and I apologize for the analogy, but it might actually need resources that the regime might supply as a result of barter, exchange, and as a result of agreements that maintain electricity, flow of oil, power grids, salaries for employees, because the Syrian regime is still paying employees even in opposition areas. So there are many scenarios that people are envisioning that are not final and eternal, but for the medium run, yes, there is a division, but I don't think it's viable. I mean, part of the problem in the entire region as a function of Sykes-Picot is that this setup that was cut up wasn't necessarily viable to begin with. So it's really actually not viable to cut it up even further. I mean, even from a logistical point of view, it's very difficult to imagine that. How to get rid of the regime?
I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it down after you answer this question.
Can we stop before I answer?
No, you can't. You have to answer the question. It's a good question. You got to like the question.
I mean, I'll say this. First of all, I'll say that all our regimes in the Arab world need some serious reformation, if not change. And that is something that is the aspiration of everybody, but most people will not speak out because they're not stupid. But in the case of Syria, the only way to have really influenced the regime is to have developed an independent, broad-based, and somewhat democratic. It doesn't have to be, the apex of democratic opposition. No opposition is completely democratic, or no revolution is completely democratic, or even democratic sometimes. But it needed to have these elements: broad-based, independent, and relatively democratic. And that was robbed from the very beginning by various players inside and outside Syria in a manner that prevented the potential of achieving collective action. Without collective action, you cannot get rid or even influence a formidable, cohesive regime that is likely to fight to the death, that is likely to apply a scorched earth policy where Syria will burn before we just leave just like that. It's not going to happen. If you know the Syrian regime and its constitution, and I'm not talking about some crystal ball stuff and some inside knowledge that I have and you don't, but if you study the Syrian regime over the decades and over the years and understands its position in struggles and so on, you will know that it is not likely to just stop because things are not looking good. It is likely to fight to the end because there is a particular conception that it will actually be massacred. And a lot of people are afraid of being massacred. A lot of Christians and Alawis and Shi'is and Ismailis in Syria and Druze, even if they don't support the regime, and most don't internalize the regime's values, they are also worried about what's happening, and that's why they will too fight under the right circumstances. It's a very interesting rational situation which was very much constructed by the regime from very early on. But the result of it is this kind of stalemate that we see. It's not just stalemate of power, it's also stalemate of populations. The regime, people supporting the regime or who are opposed to the opposite side, on the side of the regime, it's not 5 or 10 or 15%. It's more than 1/3 of the population, with a lot of guns and a lot of external support. So we're not talking about a small minority in Syria supported by the Russian power or Russian airplanes. We're talking about a relatively sizable population which is there because it's rational, not because of unending principled support for the regime's values. So that potential could have been, I don't know how it could have been, but it could have been in the absence of this kind of support. This is why I was critical, and still am critical, of the support that the opposition got, the kind of support, because I have an interest as somebody who is supportive of democratic change in the region and supportive of the rights of Syrians. I'm half Syrian, but that's not the reason. I would have liked to have seen a movement that adopted these values, because only adopting these values of being inclusive, semi-democratic, and independent would have afforded them a chance to fight, basically to fight the regime and to influence the regime, and it didn't happen.